In 1863, a woman named Sarah Collins did something that should have been impossible. She walked away from the plantation where she'd spent 28 years in bondage, clutching nothing but her freedom papers and the worn dress on her back. 3 months later, she vanished without a trace from the streets of Richmond, Virginia. For 15 years, her family searched. Her daughter checked every freedman's bureau record. Her son traveled to 3 states, following whispers and dead ends. And then, in 1878, a single photograph surfaced that would shatter everything they thought they knew about what happened to her. But before we uncover the truth behind Sarah's disappearance, a truth that reveals one of the darkest secrets of the Reconstruction era, you need to understand the world that made this possible. A world where freedom was just a word on paper, and the line between liberation and captivity was thinner than anyone dared to admit. This is the story of Sarah Collins. And what really happened will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about freedom in America. Imagine waking up on January 2nd, 1863, the day after President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation was supposed to change everything. You're Sarah Collins, 28 years old, and you just learned that according to a piece of paper signed in Washington, D.C., you are now free. But here's what that paper didn't tell you: where you would sleep that night, where your next meal would come from, how you would find your mother, sold away when you were 9 years old, or most importantly, how you would survive in a world that had spent nearly 2.5 centuries ensuring you had nothing. The Emancipation Proclamation was a military order, not a magic wand. It declared enslaved people in Confederate states to be free, but it couldn't protect them. It couldn't feed them. And it certainly couldn't erase the fact that the very people who had enslaved them still control the land, the law, and nearly every resource they needed to survive. Sarah Collins had been born into slavery on the Thornton Plantation in Chesterfield County, Virginia, in 1835. By the time she was 6 years old, she was working in the fields. By 10, she'd seen her mother dragged away in chains after being sold to a cotton plantation in Mississippi. By 15, she'd given birth to her first child, a daughter named Lucy, fathered by the plantation owner's son, in what could never be called anything but what it was: rape. For 28 years, Sarah had survived by making herself invisible. She kept her eyes down, her voice soft, her movements careful. She learned which overseers to avoid, which field hands could be trusted, which slaveholders were coming to inspect the property. She became an expert in survival through silence. But January 1st, 1863 changed the rules of survival. Now, invisibility could kill her. When word of the Emancipation Proclamation reached the Thornton Plantation in early January, carried by a Union soldier who deserted his regiment and was making his way north, the enslaved people gathered in the quarters after dark, speaking in hushed, desperate whispers. Some wanted to leave immediately. Others were terrified. Where would they go? The Thorntons had already made it clear that Lincoln's proclamation doesn't mean a damn thing on Virginia soil, and that anyone who tried to leave would be hunted down as a runaway. Sarah faced an impossible choice. She had Lucy, now 13, and a son, James, who was 11. If she stayed, they might survive another day, another week, another month. If she left, they might be caught and punished, or worse, separated. But if she stayed too long, would freedom slip away entirely? She made her decision on March 15th, 1863, after witnessing the plantation overseer whip a young man named Daniel for talking about freedom. That night, Sarah gathered her children, wrapped what little they owned in a cloth bundle, and walked off the Thornton plantation under cover darkness. Little did Sarah know, within 3 months, everything would change. But not in the way anyone could have imagined. The journey from Chesterfield County to Richmond was only 20 miles, but it might as well have been 200. Sarah and her children walked at night, hiding in tobacco barns and abandoned structures during the day. They had no map, no compass, only the North Star and the vague direction that other enslaved people had whispered about. Follow the river. Richmond is where the Union Army is. Richmond is where freedom is real. What Sarah didn't know was that Richmond was a city tearing itself apart. By spring of 1863, Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy, was under siege. Food was scarce, violence was common, and the streets were filled with a chaotic mix of Confederate soldiers, Union prisoners of war, enslaved people seeking freedom, free black people trying to survive, and white Richmonders growing more desperate by the day. When Sarah and her children arrived in Richmond on March 22, 1863, they joined thousands of other formerly enslaved people crowding into what was called a contraband camp, a makeshift settlement near the city's outskirts where people who'd fled slavery tried to build new lives. The camp was a nightmare disguised as hope. Families lived in tents made from scraps. Disease spread quickly through the cramped quarters. Food rations from the Union Army were sporadic at best. And worst of all, the camp was a hunting ground. Slave catchers prowled the edges of the contraband camps, looking for people they could claim as runaways. Some were hired by plantation owners, searching for specific enslaved people. Others were opportunists who would kidnap any black person they could find, forge documents claiming them as runaways, and collect bounties or sell them to plantations farther south. For 3 months, Sarah survived in the Richmond contraband camp. She found work as a laundress, washing clothes for Union officers for a few pennies a day. Lucy helped care for younger children in the camp, while James scrounged for food and firewood. They were hungry, exhausted, and afraid, but they were together, and they were building something that resembled a life. Everything changed on June 17, 1863. That morning, Sarah left the contraband camp before dawn to collect water from a well about a quarter-mile away. It was a routine she'd followed for weeks. Leave early, before the crowds, when the water was still clean. She never came back. Lucy and James waited all morning. By noon, Lucy was frantic. By evening, she was searching the camp, asking everyone if they'd seen her mother. Someone said they'd seen Sarah walking toward the well before sunrise. Someone else thought they'd seen a woman matching her description, talking to a white man near the edge of camp. But Sarah Collins had vanished. Lucy reported her mother's disappearance to the Union officers managing the contraband camp. They took down the information with barely concealed indifference. A black woman missing from a contraband camp? It happened all the time. People died of disease. People moved to other cities. People were caught by slave catchers. Without proof of what happened, there was nothing they could do. But the real mystery? You might think you know what happened next. You don't. What happened to Sarah Collins wouldn't be discovered for 15 years. And when the truth finally emerged, it would reveal something far more sinister than a simple kidnapping. It would expose a systematic network of re-enslavement that operated in plain sight, even as the Civil War raged and freedom was supposedly guaranteed. The truth is so much stranger than anyone imagined. At 13 years old, Lucy Collins became the head of her fractured family. With her mother gone and only her 11-year-old brother to help her, she faced the impossible task of surviving in a contraband camp where death from starvation and disease was more common than not. But Lucy refused to accept that her mother was simply gone. Every morning, she walked to the well where Sarah had disappeared, studying the ground for any sign of what might have happened. She questioned everyone in the camp. Had they seen her mother? Did they know anything about the white man someone claimed to have seen? The answers she received were variations of the same theme. Disappearances happened all the time. One woman told Lucy about her sister, who'd vanished 3 weeks earlier. A man described how his brother had gone to look for work in the city and never returned. An elderly woman warned Lucy to stop asking questions before you disappear too. But Lucy discovered something crucial. Through careful questioning, she learned about a pattern. Women, specifically, usually between the ages of 25 and 40, would disappear from the camp's edges, always early in the morning or late at night, always from areas where they were alone, and always there were vague reports of them being seen with well-dressed white men or women who claimed to be offering work. Lucy brought this information to Captain William Henderson, the Union officer in charge of the contraband camp. She begged him to investigate. She explained the pattern she'd noticed. Captain Henderson listened with what appeared to be sympathy. Then he told Lucy what every black person in America would hear in various forms for the next century. Without proof, I can't help you. Your mother probably ran off. Or she died and someone buried her. These things happen in war. But Lucy had no idea that Captain Henderson knew far more than he was saying. She had no idea that her questions had made her a target. And she had no idea that while she was searching for her mother, Sarah was less than 30 miles away, trapped in a nightmare that legally shouldn't have existed. What Lucy couldn't have known, what most people in 1863 didn't fully understand, was that the Emancipation Proclamation had created a lucrative black market in human beings. Let me explain why this happened. The proclamation declared enslaved people in Confederate states to be free, but it had no power in areas outside Union control. More importantly, it contained no enforcement mechanism. Freedom was supposed to be automatic, but in practice, it required proof, documentation, witnesses, official records. And in the chaos of war, documentation was easy to forge, destroy, or simply ignore. Slave traders and plantation owners, facing the loss of their property, developed a sophisticated system for recapturing and re-enslaving people who should have been legally free. The system worked like this. First, recruiters, well-dressed white men and women who appear respectable, would frequent areas where formerly enslaved people gathered: contraband camps, freedmen settlements, city edges. They would offer work, domestic service in a safe household, laundry work for good pay, cooking positions with room and board included. The offers were designed to target the most vulnerable: women traveling alone, people new to the city who didn't know which white people could be trusted, individuals desperate enough to take any chance at stability. Once someone accepted the offer and went with the recruiter, they would be taken not to a legitimate job, but to a way station, usually a plantation or large property in a remote area. Their few possessions would be taken, any freedom papers destroyed, and they would be told they were now enslaved. If they protested, they were shown forged documents, bills of sale, ownership papers, witness statements swearing they were runaway slaves. The documents were legal fictions. But in a courtroom or before a magistrate, these forgeries carried more weight than the word of a black person claiming to be free. The final step was resale or forced labor. Some people were sold to plantations deep in the South, far from anyone who might recognize them. Others were simply held and forced to work, with the constant threat of sale or violence ensuring compliance. This system was remarkably effective because it exploited several facts about post-emancipation America. First, the legal burden of proof fell on black people to prove they were free, not on white people to prove ownership. Second, most formerly enslaved people had no documentation at all. No birth certificates, no freedom papers, nothing that could legally establish their status. Third, law enforcement and judicial systems in Confederate-controlled areas were actively hostile to black freedom, and even in Union-controlled areas, they were often indifferent. And fourth, this is the part that made the system almost impossible to disrupt. Many white officials, including some Union officers, were complicit. They received bribes to look the other way. They accepted forged documents without question. Some even participated directly in the kidnapping and re-enslavement operations. This was the system that had swallowed Sarah Collins. In July 1863, a month after Sarah's disappearance, Lucy heard from another woman in the camp that someone had seen her mother in Petersburg, a city about 23 miles south of Richmond. The woman claimed Sarah was working as a cook in a hotel. Lucy was desperate enough to believe it might be true. She convinced James that they needed to go to Petersburg. With no money and no way to travel safely, they walked, taking 3 days to cover the distance. Petersburg was under Union control, but barely. The city was on the edge of the war's front lines, and violence could erupt at any moment. Lucy and James made their way to the hotel mentioned in the report, a shabby building near the docks. The woman working in the kitchen wasn't Sarah. She was someone else's mother, also named Sarah, also in her late 20s. also trying to survive. When Lucy explained why she was there, the woman's face crumpled. "I'm sorry, child," she said. "I wish I was your mama. I wish I could help." But before Lucy and James could leave Petersburg, something happened that would prove crucial to finding Sarah, though they wouldn't know it for years. A black preacher named Reverend Marcus Whitfield approached him outside the hotel. He'd heard Lucy asking about her mother. He told him he ran a kind of informal intelligence network, tracking missing people, gathering information about kidnappings and re-enslavement operations. "I can't promise I'll find your mother," Reverend Whitfield said, "but I can promise I'll remember her name. And if I hear anything at all, I'll get word to you in Richmond." Lucy gave him every detail she could about Sarah. Her age, her appearance, the Thornton plantation where she'd been enslaved, the date she disappeared, everything. Reverend Whitfield wrote it all down in a small leather journal he carried. Then he told Lucy something that would haunt her for years. If your mother was taken by catchers, you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that you won't find her. Not alive, not the same. This war is doing things to people, terrible things, and black folks are carrying the worst of it. Lucy and James walked back to Richmond, arriving exhausted and hopeless. Lucy was beginning to believe that her mother was dead. It seemed like the only explanation that made sense. But Sarah had no idea that thousands of people were disappearing just like her mother, vanishing into a shadow system that operated in the spaces between slavery and freedom, in the chaos between war and peace, in the gap between what the law said and what the law could actually enforce. While Lucy searched desperately for her mother, Sarah Collins was living through a nightmare 30 miles away. The morning of June 17, 1863, when Sarah left contraband camp to collect water, she'd been approached by a white woman who introduced herself as Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell. Mrs. Hartwell was well-dressed, soft-spoken, and appeared kind, exactly the kind of person Sarah had been taught to trust, or at least not to openly distrust. "I've been watching you," Mrs. Hartwell said. "You're a hard worker. I need someone to help with my household. Cooking, cleaning, mending. I can pay you $1 a week, plus room and board for you and your children. It's a good position. $1 a week." It was more than Sarah had earned in months of washing clothes for Union soldiers. More importantly, it meant stability, a real roof, regular meals, safety for Lucy and James. "Can I bring my children?" Sarah asked. "I have a daughter and a son. They're good children, hard workers." "Of course," Mrs. Hartwell smiled. "Fetch them now. My carriage is just outside the camp. We'll go together." Sarah should have questioned why a respectable white woman would be recruiting domestic help at dawn in a contraband camp. She should have wondered why there was such urgency, why Mrs. Hartwell didn't want to tell anyone where she was going. She should have been suspicious. But Sarah was exhausted, desperate, and, like so many formerly enslaved people, had spent her entire life being trained to comply with white authority without question. "Let me just get them," Sarah said. "I'll be right back." Actually, Mrs. Hartwell's voice hardened slightly. "Why don't you come with me now? We'll send someone back for the children once you're settled. I need to get back home. My husband is expecting me." Every instinct in Sarah's body screamed danger, but Mrs. Hartwell was already walking toward a carriage parked at the edge of the camp, and something in her tone made it clear this wasn't actually a request. Sarah followed her to the carriage. She never saw her children again. The carriage ride took about 2 hours. Mrs. Hartwell made pleasant conversation at first, asking about Sarah's experience, her skills, her children. But as they got farther from Richmond, moving into rural countryside, Mrs. Hartwell's demeanor changed. The pleasant smile disappeared. The soft voice became cold and businesslike. "You'll work for me now," Mrs. Hartwell said flatly. "You'll do exactly as I say when I say it without question. If you try to run, I'll have you hunted down and severely punished. If you tell anyone you're supposed to be free, I'll have you sold so far south you'll never see daylight again. Do you understand?" Sarah understood. She understood that she'd been tricked. She understood that whatever freedom papers she'd had were meaningless now. She understood that she was enslaved again, and at this time there was no Union army, no contraband camp, no one who even knew where she was. The Hartwell property was a mid-sized tobacco farm in Powhatan County, about 30 miles west of Richmond. It was in Confederate-controlled territory, far enough from Union lines that no one would interfere, isolated enough that screams wouldn't be heard. There were 5 other black people on the property. All of them had been recruited the same way Sarah had. All of them had been told they were slaves again. All of them had been threatened with violence, sale, or worse if they tried to escape. William Hartwell, Elizabeth's husband, was a former slave trader who'd seen the writing on the wall with the Emancipation Proclamation. His business model had shifted from legal slave trading to illegal kidnapping and re-enslavement. He had connections with plantation owners across Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia who were willing to pay for enslaved people with no questions asked about where they came from. For the Hartwells, Sarah was an investment. They would work her as long as she was useful, then sell her when they found a buyer willing to pay enough. In the meantime, she cooked, cleaned, washed clothes, and worked in the tobacco fields from dawn until well after dark. Sarah's freedom papers, a single sheet she'd carried in the pocket of her dress, were burned in front of her the first night. "You have no papers," William Hartwell told her. "You have no proof you were ever free. You're a slave, and you'll die a slave." Just when it seemed like Sarah had lost everything, something happened that no one saw coming. One of the other enslaved people on the Hartwell property was a man named Samuel Grant. Samuel had been kidnapped from a contraband camp in Norfolk 6 months earlier. He was 42 years old, and before being enslaved, he'd been a sailor who'd worked on merchant ships trading along the Atlantic coast. Samuel had been planning his escape for months. He'd been carefully studying the property, the guards, the patterns of when the Hartwells were most vulnerable. He'd been hoarding supplies, bits of food, a knife he'd stolen from the kitchen, pieces of rope and cloth he'd hidden in the tobacco barn. 2 weeks after Sarah arrived, Samuel approached her while they were working the fields. "I'm leaving," he told her quietly. "Tomorrow night. You can come with me if you want. I can't promise we'll make it, but staying here is a slow death anyway." Sarah had to make an impossible choice. If she stayed, she might survive another day, another week, maybe even long enough to eventually be sold to a plantation where she might somehow get word to Lucy and James. If she tried to escape and failed, the punishment would be brutal, probably death. But if she didn't try, she would never see her children again. What happened in the next 24 hours would determine everything. June 30th, 1863, 2 weeks after Sarah's kidnapping. The weather was thick and humid, the kind of Virginia summer night where the air felt like a wet blanket. Samuel had chosen this night carefully. William Hartwell had gone to Richmond on business and wouldn't return until the next afternoon. Elizabeth Hartwell usually drank heavily when her husband was gone. By 10 at night, she'd be passed out in the main house. The 2 guards who watched the property at night were lazy and predictable, making their rounds at the same times every hour. The plan was simple but dangerous. At midnight, when the guards were on the far side of property, Samuel and Sarah would slip out of quarters, make their way to the tree line behind the tobacco barn, and then move east toward Union lines near Richmond. They'd have to cover 30 miles through hostile territory, avoiding Confederate patrols, slave catchers, and locals who would be all too happy to report runaway slaves for a reward. They had no food, no weapons except Samuel's stolen knife, no map, and no guarantee that they wouldn't be caught and killed within the first mile. Sarah spent the day terrified. Every time Elizabeth Hartwell looked at her, she was convinced the woman knew something. Every time one of the guards walked past, she thought they were watching her more closely than usual. But midnight came, and the moment arrived. Sarah and Samuel slipped out of quarters as quietly as they could. The other enslaved people on the property knew what was happening. One woman whispered, "Go with God," as they left, but no one tried to stop them or come with them. They'd all made their own calculations about risk and survival. They made it to the tree line. They made it half a mile into the woods, moving slowly, trying not to make noise. They made it to a creek where they could drink and rest for a moment, and then they heard the dogs. The Hartwells had kept bloodhounds specifically for this purpose, tracking people who tried to run. The dogs were trained to follow human scent, and they were terrifyingly good at their job. Sarah and Samuel heard the baying of the hound behind them, maybe a quarter-mile back, but gaining fast. They heard shouting. William Hartwell had apparently returned early from Richmond, or Elizabeth had somehow discovered they were gone. They ran. Samuel led Sarah through the creek, splashing upstream to try to throw off the scent. They climbed through thick underbrush that tore at their clothes and skin. They ran until Sarah's lungs felt like they were going to burst, until her legs wouldn't hold her anymore, until every breath was agony. The dogs got closer. The shouting got louder. "We have to split up," Samuel gasped. "Maybe they'll follow me and you can get away. Head east. Find Union soldiers. Tell them about the Hartwells. Tell them about all of us." Before Sarah could respond, Samuel changed direction, crashing through the underbrush away from her, making as much noise as possible to draw attention. The dogs followed Samuel. Sarah pressed herself against a fallen tree, trying not to breathe, trying not to move, listening to the sound of Samuel being hunted through the dark woods. She heard more shouting. She heard the dogs reach their target. She heard Samuel scream. And then she heard a single gunshot. The woods went silent. Sarah stayed frozen against that fallen tree for hours, long after the sound of the hunt faded, long after she heard William Hartwell and his guards returning to property. She stayed there until dawn started to break, until she was so cold and stiff she could barely move. Samuel Grant had sacrificed himself, so she might have a chance to escape. But Sarah had no idea if she should keep running toward freedom, or if being caught was inevitable. She had no idea if the Hartwells would even notice she was gone, or if they were already searching for her. She had no idea if her children were alive, or safe, or thinking about her. All she knew was that she was alone in the woods 30 miles from Richmond, with no food, no resources, and no plan except survival. What Sarah decided in that moment would determine not just her fate, but the fate of dozens of other people trapped in the Hartwells' kidnapping operation. As the sun rose on July 1st, 1863, Sarah Collins faced a decision that would change everything. She could keep running. Union lines were somewhere to the east, maybe 20 miles, maybe 30. If she could make it there, she might find safety. She might eventually find Lucy and James. She might even be able to tell someone about the Hartwells and the other people being held on their property. But the journey would be dangerous. She'd have to travel in daylight, through areas crawling with Confederate soldiers and civilians who would immediately recognize a black woman traveling alone as either a runaway slave or a freed person they could claim as one. She had no papers, no proof of identity, nothing that could protect her if she was caught. Or she could go back to the Hartwell property, claim she'd been lost in the woods or confused, accept whatever punishment they would give her, and continue to survive as long as possible. It was a choice that enslaved people had been making for centuries. The calculation that surviving another day, even in bondage, was better than the risk of running toward a freedom that might not exist. But Sarah thought about Samuel, who'd just given his life to give her a chance. She thought about Lucy and James, waiting for her in Richmond. She thought about the 5 other people still trapped on the Hartwell property, who would continue to be exploited and eventually sold if no one ever exposed what was happening. And she thought about something her mother had told her before she was sold away, back when Sarah was 9 years old. Her mother had grabbed her face with both hands and said, "You remember who you are. Don't matter what they call you. Don't matter what papers they write. You remember you're mine. You're free in your soul, and someday that freedom will be real." Sarah stood up from behind a fallen tree. She didn't go east toward Union lines. She went back. When Sarah walked back onto the Hartwell property around mid-morning on July 1st, Elizabeth Hartwell was standing in the yard, her face twisted with rage. "Where the hell have you been?" Elizabeth demanded. "I got lost in the woods," Sarah said, her voice flat and defeated. "I heard the commotion last night, and I got scared and ran. I didn't know where I was going. I'm sorry." Elizabeth studied her suspiciously. They both knew Sarah was lying. But William Hartwell had bigger problems. Samuel Grant was dead, and that represented a significant financial loss. William hadn't planned to kill Samuel. He'd planned to sell him. Now, he was out several $100s and would have to dispose of a body. "Get in the barn," Elizabeth said. "You'll be punished later." But here's what really happened. The part that wouldn't be discovered for 15 years. Sarah had gone back with a plan. It was a desperate, dangerous, probably doomed plan, but it was something. While she'd been hiding in the woods, she'd found a piece of cloth torn from Samuel's shirt, caught on a tree branch along the path they'd taken. She'd kept it, and on that cloth, Samuel had somehow managed to scrawl a single word in charcoal or dirt or blood: Whitfield. Samuel had known about Reverend Marcus Whitfield. He'd known about the informal network tracking missing people. And in his last moments, somehow, he'd tried to leave evidence. Sarah understood. If she could somehow get information about the Hartwell operation to Reverend Whitfield, he might be able to do something. But she was trapped on the property, watched constantly, with no way to communicate with the outside world. So Sarah began to document everything. Over the next several months, Sarah became a spy in her own captivity. She memorized the names of every black person who was brought to the Hartwell property. She noted when they were sold and to whom. She listened when William Hartwell met with other white men to discuss their business, the kidnapping and re-enslavement operation that was apparently much larger than just the Hartwell's farm. Sarah learned that there were at least 6 other properties in Virginia operating similar schemes. She learned the names of Union officers who were being paid to look the other way. She learned about a magistrate in Richmond who was forging legal documents to legitimize the re-enslavement of people who should have been free. And she began to write it all down. Writing was dangerous. Enslaved people weren't supposed to be literate. If Sarah was caught with written documentation of what she was seeing, the punishment would be brutal. But Sarah had secretly learned to read and write as a child, taught by another enslaved woman who'd been punished when their enslavers discovered what she was doing. Sarah stole scraps of paper from the Hartwell's house, torn edges of letters, pages from old ledgers, anything she could find. She used charcoal from the fire, or sometimes water mixed with dirt to make a kind of ink. She wrote in tiny, cramped letters, documenting everything on pieces of paper small enough to hide in the seams of her dress or under loose floorboards in the slave quarters. For 2 years, Sarah documented the Hartwell operation. She documented the names of 23 people who were kidnapped and brought to property. She documented the sales of 15 of them to plantations in Georgia, Alabama, and Louisiana. She documented the names of 4 Union officers who received payments from William Hartwell. She documented the dates and details of meetings where Hartwell and other re-enslavers discussed their operations. But Sarah still had no way to get this information to anyone who could use it. And then, in April 1865, the war ended. When Lee surrendered at Appomattox on April 9th, 1865, the war was officially over. The 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery, was making its way toward ratification. Freedom, real legal freedom, was coming. But on the Hartwell property, nothing changed. William Hartwell gathered everyone. The 8 black people currently being held on his property, including Sarah, and told them exactly what he thought of the Confederacy surrender. "Lincoln and his government can say whatever they want," Hartwell announced. "But I own this land, and I own you. Nothing has changed. You're still slaves, and if any of you think about running, I'll kill you myself before I let you go." It was a bluff, but it was a convincing one. Hartwell still had guns, guards, and the willingness to use violence. The 8 people he held captive had nothing but each other. But Sarah had been preparing for this moment. On the night of April 15th, the same night Abraham Lincoln was shot at Ford's Theater, though no one on the Hartwell property would learn about it for days. Sarah made her move. She gathered the 8 people in the quarters after the Hartwells had gone to sleep. She showed them the documents she'd been hiding, the evidence she'd been collecting. She told them about Reverend Whitfield, and she told them they had to escape together, all of them, and bring the evidence with them. They can't watch all of us if we all run at once, Sarah said. Some of us might get caught. Some of us might die. But if even one of us makes it to Union soldiers with this evidence, the Hartwells will be stopped, and maybe the people they sold will be found. It was the moment of maximum tension. Every person in that room had to decide, stay in the certainty of captivity or run toward the uncertainty of freedom. They chose freedom. On April 18th, 1865, all 8 people enslaved on the Hartwell property escaped at once. They didn't try to be subtle. They armed themselves with whatever they could find: farming tools, kitchen knives, pieces of wood. When William Hartwell discovered them leaving, they stood their ground. When he threatened them, they threatened him back. When he reached for his gun, one of the men, a formerly enslaved person named Jacob, who'd been kidnapped 9 months earlier, tackled him before he could fire. They tied up William and Elizabeth Hartwell, locked them in the main house, and left. The journey to Union lines took 3 days. They traveled in daylight, openly, no longer caring who saw them. The war was over. Slavery was over. And they were done hiding. On April 21st, 1865, they reached a Union Army encampment outside Richmond. Sarah asked to speak to whoever was in charge. She was taken to a colonel named Thomas Bradford, who listened with growing shock as Sarah explained everything. The Hartwell operation, the names of people who'd been kidnapped and sold, the Union officers who'd been bribed, the network of re-enslavement operations across Virginia. And then Sarah showed him the documents. 2 years' worth of evidence, written on scraps of paper and charcoal and makeshift ink, documenting one of the most systematic violations of the Emancipation Proclamation that had yet been discovered. Colonel Bradford immediately dispatched soldiers to arrest William and Elizabeth Hartwell. He sent investigators to track down the other properties Sarah had documented, and he assigned an officer to help Sarah search for her children. This is what really happened. After 2 years of captivity, of documenting atrocities, of surviving when survival seemed impossible, Sarah Collins had done something extraordinary. She'd turned herself into a witness, an archivist, a historical record that would expose a crime most people didn't even know was happening. But even this wasn't the end of the story. When Sarah Collins walked into the Richmond Freedmen's Bureau office on April 25th, 1865, she was looking for any record of Lucy and James Collins. The Bureau had been established to help formerly enslaved people reunite with family members, find work, and navigate freedom. The clerk checked the records. There was no listing for Lucy or James Collins. Sarah's heart sank. In the 2 years she'd been held by the Hartwells, anything could have happened to her children. They could have died from disease, starvation, or violence. They could have been kidnapped like she was. They could have moved to another city, another state, searching for her. Wait, the clerk said, looking at another ledger. There's a listing for a Lucy Collins who registered inquiries about a missing mother named Sarah. Last known address was a boarding house on Clay Street. Sarah ran the entire way to Clay Street. The boarding house was a shabby 3-story building that housed freed people trying to establish themselves in Richmond. Sarah knocked on the door, asked for Lucy Collins, and was told that Lucy worked at a laundry 3 blocks away. Sarah walked to the laundry on legs that felt like they might give out at any moment. She stood outside, watching through the window as a young woman, no longer 13 but 15 now, taller, thinner, with an exhaustion in her movements that Sarah recognized, stirred a massive pot of boiling water and linens. Sarah opened the door. Lucy looked up. For a moment, they just stared at each other. Lucy's face went through confusion, disbelief, recognition, and then something that looked like she might collapse. "Mama?" Lucy whispered. "I'm here, baby," Sarah said. "I'm here." They held each other in that laundry, both of them crying, while the other workers stopped what they were doing to witness the reunion. Lucy kept saying, "I thought you were dead. I thought you were dead," over and over, and Sarah kept saying, I know, I'm sorry." James was alive, too. He was working at the docks, loading and unloading cargo. When Lucy brought Sarah to him that evening, James, now 13 years old, nearly a man, broke down sobbing in a way that 13-year-old boys aren't supposed to cry. The Collins family was together again. Against impossible odds, they'd survived. The legal case against William and Elizabeth Hartwell moved quickly by the standards of 1865, which meant it took nearly a year. Sarah's documentation proved crucial. Her handwritten records corroborated testimony from the other 7 people who'd been held on the Hartwell property. Union investigators tracked down 12 of the 23 people who'd been kidnapped and sold by the Hartwells, bringing them back from plantations across the South. The case revealed the full scope of the re-enslavement network. 6 other properties in Virginia had been operating similar operations. At least 4 Union officers had accepted bribes. A magistrate in Richmond had forged hundreds of ownership documents. And an estimated 400 to 600 people had been illegally kidnapped and re-enslaved in Virginia alone between 1863 and 1865. The trial of William and Elizabeth Hartwell began in February 1866 in Richmond. It was one of the first major prosecutions of re-enslavement operations in the post-war South. Sarah testified for 3 hours, describing her kidnapping, her captivity, and the systematic operation she'd witnessed. She brought her documentation to the witness stand. She named names, recited dates, provided details that could be verified against other records. The defense argued that the Hartwells had legitimate ownership documents for the people they'd held. They argued that the chaos of war had made it impossible to determine who was legally enslaved and who was free. They argued that the Hartwells were simply trying to protect their property rights. The jury, composed entirely of white men, 6 of whom had owned slaves before the war, deliberated for 4 days. They found William Hartwell guilty of kidnapping and unlawful detention. They found Elizabeth Hartwell guilty as an accessory. The sentences were shockingly light by modern standards. William received 5 years in prison. Elizabeth received 2 years. But here's what made the verdict significant. It established legal precedent that the Emancipation Proclamation had immediate force, that re-enslavement operations were criminal, and that black testimony could be valid evidence in court. For 1866, this was revolutionary. The reunion of the Collins family should have been a happy ending. In many ways, they were alive, they were together, they were legally free. But freedom came with costs that no one had prepared them for. Lucy had spent 2 years believing her mother was dead, working 12-hour days just to keep herself and James alive. She'd grown up too fast, taken on responsibilities no 13-year-old should have to bear. She had nightmares. She couldn't sleep unless she knew exactly where James was. She trusted almost no one. James had become quiet and withdrawn. The talkative 11-year-old boy Sarah remembered had become a 13-year-old who spoke in monosyllables and kept his emotions locked down. And Sarah carried the weight of Samuel Grant's death. She'd survived because he'd sacrificed himself. She'd freed others because she'd stayed captive. But surviving came with a kind of guilt that never fully went away. The Collins family tried to build a life in Richmond. Sarah found work as a cook. Lucy continued at the laundry. James worked at the docks. They rented a small room in a boarding house and tried to create something that felt like normalcy. But Reconstruction-era Richmond was a dangerous place for black families. The war had ended slavery, but it hadn't ended racism, violence, or the determination of many white Southerners to reinstate white supremacy by any means necessary. In 1870, 5 years after their reunion, the Collins family made a decision that thousands of other formerly enslaved families were making. They left the South. They moved to Philadelphia, where Lucy had heard there were more opportunities, less violence, and communities of black people who'd established themselves in freedom. They took almost nothing with them, just the clothes on their backs and Sarah's documentation from the Hartwell property, which she'd kept all these years. In Philadelphia, The Collins family finally found something resembling stability. Sarah cooked for a Quaker family who treated her with respect and paid her fairly. Lucy married a man named Thomas Wright who worked as a carpenter. James learned to read and write properly, and eventually became a teacher at a school for black children. They built lives. They built families. They survived. But the trauma of what they'd endured never fully left them. Sarah Collins lived until 1889, dying at age 54 from pneumonia. By the time she died, she'd seen the rise of Reconstruction, the promise of the 14th and 15th Amendments, and the betrayal of those promises as federal troops withdrew from the South and Jim Crow laws began to take hold. Before she died, Sarah gave her documentation from the Hartwell property, all those scraps of paper she'd risked her life to write, to Lucy. Someone needs to remember, Sarah told her daughter. Someone needs to know what happened. Lucy kept the documents for the rest of her life. When she died in 1924, she passed them to her own daughter, Sarah's granddaughter, also named Sarah. And that's where this story takes its final turn. In 1878, 13 years after Sarah's escape from the Hartwell property, a photographer in Philadelphia took a portrait of the Collins family. It was one of the first photographs ever taken of them. Sarah, Lucy, James, and Lucy's new husband Thomas all posed formally, dressed in their best clothes. The photograph was meant to be a celebration. Look at us. Look at what we built. Look at how we survived. But hidden in the photograph, invisible unless you knew to look for it, Sarah held a small piece of paper in her hand. It was one of the documents from her captivity, folded small enough to be hidden in her palm. She was still bearing witness, still making sure someone remembered. That photograph survived. It was passed down through the Collins family for generations. And in 1952, when it was donated to the Library of Congress as part of a collection of post-Civil War African-American family photographs, historians finally noticed the paper in Sarah's hand. They tracked down the Collins family descendants. They found the full cache of Sarah's documentation, and they realized they discovered one of the most detailed first-hand accounts of re-enslavement operations during Reconstruction ever recorded. Sarah's documentation is now part of the permanent collection at the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. It's been cited in dozens of historical studies. It's been used to teach students about the gap between emancipation and actual freedom. It's been instrumental in helping historians understand the scope of kidnapping and re-enslavement operations in the post-war South. But here's what historians still debate. How many others like Sarah were there? How many people vanished after freedom and never made it back? How many stories were lost because no one survived to tell them, or because survivors were silenced, or because the trauma was too great to speak about? Sarah Collins' story survived because she had the courage to document it, the luck to escape, and the determination to make sure someone remembered. But for every Sarah whose story was preserved, there were likely dozens, maybe hundreds, whose stories disappeared completely. The evidence that emerged decades later suggests that re-enslavement operations were far more widespread than anyone realized at the time. Conservative estimates suggest that between 1863 and 1870, somewhere between 2,000 and 5,000 black people in the South were kidnapped and illegally re-enslaved after they should have been legally free. That's 2,000 to 5,000 Sarah Collinses, and most of them never made it home. But here's what most people don't realize about Sarah Collins' story. It reveals one of the most uncomfortable truths about American freedom. Freedom wasn't something that happened on a specific date. It wasn't granted by a proclamation or guaranteed by an amendment. Freedom was something black people had to fight for, document, prove, and defend every single day, often against a legal system that was designed to make that fight as difficult as possible. The Emancipation Proclamation was issued on January 1st, 1863. The 13th Amendment was ratified on December 6th, 1865. But for people like Sarah Collins, freedom existed in the gap between what the law said and what the law could actually enforce. Think about what Sarah's story tells us. She was legally free on January 1st, 1863, according to the Emancipation Proclamation. But she was kidnapped and re-enslaved on June 17, 1863. 5.5 months after emancipation was supposed to have taken effect. She remained enslaved for 2 more years, well into the period when the war had ended and slavery had been constitutionally abolished. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was a systematic operation that functioned openly, with the knowledge and sometimes complicity of law enforcement, judicial officials, and military officers who were supposed to be protecting newly freed people. The gap between legal freedom and actual freedom was where people like the Hartwells operated. They exploited the fact that black people had no documentation, no proof of their status, no legal standing to challenge white people's claims of ownership. They exploited the fact that the legal system placed a burden of proof on black people to demonstrate they were free, rather than on white people to demonstrate legitimate ownership. And they exploited something even more fundamental, the belief, deeply embedded in American society, that black people were property first and human beings second. This wasn't an isolated incident. Across the country, similar stories played out in different forms. In Kentucky, which wasn't covered by the Emancipation Proclamation because it never seceded, slavery remained legal until the 13th Amendment was ratified in December 1865. That meant black people in Kentucky who tried to claim freedom were arrested as runaways and returned to enslavement. In Texas, news of the Emancipation Proclamation didn't arrive until June 19, 1865, 2.5 years after it was issued. That's why we celebrate Juneteenth. But even after Juneteenth, many plantation owners in Texas simply didn't tell the people they'd enslaved that they were free. Some people remained in effective slavery for years after legal emancipation, working on plantations where they were told nothing had changed. In Maryland and Missouri, which abolished slavery through state action before the 13th Amendment, thousands of formerly enslaved people were arrested under vagrancy laws that made it illegal to be unemployed or homeless. They were then subjected to forced labor as punishment for these crimes. Throughout the South, the system of convict leasing emerged almost immediately after emancipation. Black people were arrested on spurious charges, sentenced to labor, and then leased out of plantations, mines, and construction projects. It was slavery by another name, and it persisted well into the 20th century. The pattern was clear. Legal emancipation didn't automatically translate to actual freedom. White Americans who built their wealth on slavery weren't willing to simply accept the loss of that wealth. They found ways to maintain control, to extract labor, to preserve racial hierarchy, sometimes through legal means, sometimes through extra-legal violence, and sometimes through operations like the Hartwells that existed in the gray area between. Sarah Collins' story almost didn't survive. If she hadn't documented what happened to her, if she hadn't escaped, if she hadn't testified at the Hartwell trial, if Lucy hadn't preserved the documents, if the Collins family descendants hadn't donated the photographs and papers to the Library of Congress, any one of these things not happening would have meant this story disappeared completely. And that's the deeper truth. Most stories like Sarah's did disappear. The historical record of the immediate post-emancipation period is incomplete by design. Many formerly enslaved people couldn't read or write, so they couldn't document their experiences. Many who could document their experiences were afraid to, knowing that testimony could put them in danger. Many who tried to testify found that courts wouldn't accept their testimony, or that prosecutors wouldn't pursue cases, or that white juries wouldn't convict white defendants of crimes against black victims. The Freedmen's Bureau, established to help formerly enslaved people transition to freedom, was chronically underfunded and understaffed. It existed for only 7 years before being dismantled. Much of its documentation was lost or destroyed. The cases it did pursue often ended in frustration, as local authorities refused to cooperate. And beyond institutional failures, there was a deliberate effort to erase these stories. During the rise of the lost cause mythology in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, white Southerners worked to create a romanticized version of slavery and Reconstruction that minimized the violence of slavery and portrayed emancipation as a disaster. Stories like Sarah's, stories that revealed the brutality of slavery and the criminality of those who tried to maintain it, didn't fit that narrative, so they were forgotten. Deliberately, systematically forgotten. Sarah's story survived because she refused to let it be forgotten, because she documented it at great personal risk, because she testified even when doing so was dangerous, because she passed the evidence to her daughter with the instruction, someone needs to remember. There's something else Sarah's story reveals, something about human resilience and the cost of survival. Sarah survived 2 years of re-enslavement by making herself useful to her captors while secretly documenting their crimes. She survived by appearing compliant while planning resistance. She survived by accepting that she might not live to see justice, but working to make justice possible for others. This is a pattern we see throughout history in situations of extreme oppression. Enslaved people survive by appearing to accept their condition while finding small ways to resist, sabotaging equipment, slowing down work, preserving cultural practices, planning escapes. Holocaust survivors survive by making themselves indispensable while secretly preserving evidence of the crimes being committed. Political prisoners survive by appearing broken while maintaining their humanity in secret ways. It's a kind of double consciousness, being forced to perform submission while maintaining internal resistance, and it comes with enormous psychological costs. Sarah carried the trauma of her re-enslavement for the rest of her life. Lucy never fully recovered from the 2 years she spent believing her mother was dead. James remained emotionally closed off even as an adult. The survival strategies that got them through captivity and separation became burdens they carried in freedom. Hypervigilance, mistrust, emotional suppression, the inability to feel truly safe. These are the invisible scars of trauma. And here's what's important to understand. This trauma didn't end with Sarah, Lucy, and James. Trauma like this gets passed down through generations. It affects how parents raise children, how families function, how communities relate to authority and each other. The descendants of enslaved people in America are still living with the intergenerational trauma of slavery, just as Sarah's descendants carried the weight of her story long after she died. So what does Sarah Collins' story teach us? First, it teaches us that freedom is never simply granted. It has to be fought for, defended, and constantly maintained. The gap between legal rights and actual rights is where oppression operates. Having a law that says you're free doesn't mean you're actually free if that law isn't enforced. If institutions don't protect you, if society doesn't accept your freedom as legitimate. Second, it teaches us about the importance of documentation and testimony. Sarah's documents mattered not just for prosecuting the Hartwells, but for the historical record. They provided evidence of a crime that many people wanted to pretend didn't exist. Without her documentation, we would know far less about re-enslavement operations during Reconstruction. Third, it teaches us about the cost of survival. Sarah survived, but survival came with trauma that affected her for the rest of her life. Victory isn't always triumphant. Sometimes victory looks like living with the weight of what you survived, trying to build something normal out of pieces that remain. And finally, it teaches us about the importance of memory. Sarah told Lucy, "Someone needs to remember." She understood that history tends to forget uncomfortable truths, that stories of oppression and resistance get erased if no one fights to preserve them. The fact that we can tell Sarah's story today is because she fought to document it, because Lucy fought to preserve it, because descendants fought to share it, and because historians fought to contextualize it. How many other stories weren't preserved? How many other Sarah Collinses vanished without a trace, without documentation, without anyone to remember them? We'll never know. But we can honor them by refusing to forget the ones whose stories did survive. So what really happened to Sarah Collins? The slave who vanished after freedom? She was kidnapped by a systematic re-enslavement operation that exploited the gap between legal emancipation and actual freedom. She was held for 2 years on a rural Virginia property where she was forced back into slavery that should have been illegal. She documented the entire operation at great personal risk. She escaped with 7 other people, brought evidence that helped prosecute her captors, and reunited with her children against impossible odds. She survived, but survival came at a cost that she carried for the rest of her life. Sarah Collins' story reminds us that freedom in America has never been automatic, especially for Black Americans. It's been a constant struggle against systems designed to deny it, against violence meant to suppress it, against a getting meant to erase it. Her story also reminds us that resistance takes many forms. Sometimes resistance looks like running toward freedom. Sometimes it looks like staying in captivity to document crimes. Sometimes it looks like surviving long enough to testify. Sometimes it looks like passing evidence to your daughter and saying, someone needs to remember. And here's something that will stay with you. Sarah's documentation is still being studied today. Historians continue to find new information in her careful records. Names of people who were kidnapped, details of operations that extended beyond what anyone realized, evidence of complicity by officials who should have protected free people. In 2019, researchers using Sarah's documents identified 3 people who'd been kidnapped from Richmond in 1864 and sold to a plantation in Georgia. They were able to trace those people's descendants who had been searching for information about their ancestors for decades. Sarah's act of documentation, those scraps of paper she risked her life to write, is still reuniting families more than 150 years later. That's the power of refusing to forget. That's the power of bearing witness, even when witnessing is dangerous. That's the power of saying someone needs to remember and then making sure they do. If you found Sarah's story as powerful as I did, I want to hear from you in the comments. What aspect of the story surprised you most? Did you know that re-enslavement operations existed after the Emancipation Proclamation? And what other stories from this period do you want to learn about? Because here's the truth. There are hundreds of stories like Sarah's that have been forgotten or deliberately erased. Stories of resistance, survival, courage, and determination that don't fit the simplified narratives we were taught in school.